So this young lady right here went by the name of Fat Louisa. This photo was taken in 1902, okay? Fat Louisa was a Pima Indian. The Pima are a Native American tribe in Arizona. They live south of Phoenix. They are now the poster children in America for having the highest rates of obesity and diabetes of any population. But the little known fact about the Pima is they used to be the most affluent Native American tribe, okay? They were hunters and gatherers and farmers. They hunted in the fields. They fished in the Gila River. They farmed. They raised pigs and sheep. And in 1846, when a U.S. Army battalion went through the Pima territory on what would become the Santa Fe Trail, the Army surgeon described them as sprightly and in fine health. This drawing was made about 5 years later. They had the greatest abundance of food. They had warehouses full of food, this tribe. And then gold is discovered in California, and they had so much food that when the 49ers went through, 20 to 60,000 49ers went west on the Santa Fe Trail, and the U.S. government asked the Pima to feed them, which they did. And then some of these travelers started settling in the Pima territory. Anglo-Americans and Mexicans settled there. They diverted the Gila River water to irrigate their own streams. They overhunted the mountains. And by the 1870s, 1880s, the Pima were starving. Their whole society had been decimated. And they went through 3 decades of famine. And in 1902, when a Harvard anthropologist came to live with the Pima and wrote the definitive work on them, a guy named Frank Russo, he was dying of tuberculosis, and he hoped that by living in Arizona he could survive, which he didn't. The Pima were living on a reservation. They were poorer than we could possibly imagine. They were eating government rations to survive. And as Russell put it, Russell took this photo of Fat Louise, and he said, many old persons exhibit a degree of obesity that is in striking contrast with the tall and sinewy Indian conventionalized in popular thought. So they had gone from being prosperous to extreme poverty. Remember, our hypothesis is increased prosperity makes you fat. But here's a population that went from being prosperous to poor, and obesity appeared. So it's the opposite of what we would expect from our calories in, calories out idea. So one of the things you could do is then go through and look for other examples of populations that have a lot of obesity but don't have any elements of this toxic environment. No fast food joints, no McDonald's, no supersizing, no cheese curls. The parents don't care what the kids do. They don't have computers or video games. And like this photo, for instance, was taken in 1972 of fish women in Nigeria, market women in Nigeria, and you could see that they were obese. And actually, one of the things that prompted me to do this exercise was when I was doing the research for the book, I talked to a guy at Berkeley, a famous metabolism expert, and he was talking about the obesity epidemic, and he said, could you believe it? There are even fat people in Africa these days. And I grew up reading National Geographic, remembering photos like this, thinking, weren't there always fat people in Africa? So you go and you do these studies, and one of those, I'm going to give you about half a dozen of the dozen that I found. And the first one was Sioux at the South Dakota Crow Creek Reservation, 1928. This was a couple University of Chicago economists went out to study this population, and they could have defined the term dirt poor. Like when we came up with that term, we were thinking of people like these Sioux. They lived in 1 to 2 room shacks that were defined in the papers unfit for occupancy. 4 to 8 people per room. 40% of the children on this reservation lived in homes without toilets. Water had to be drawn from the river. There was no plumbing. 15 families on the reservation with 32 children among them were living chiefly on bread and coffee. And yet, if you look at it, the obesity rates weren't that dissimilar to what we have in the United States today. 40% of the women were distinctly fat, a quarter of the men, 10% of the children. And then 20% of the women were extremely thin, and a quarter of the men and children. So this is a combination of obesity and malnutrition in the same population that I'm going to come back to because it's a really important observation. African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina in 1959, 30% of the women and 18% of the men were obese on family incomes of maximum $53 a week. That's about $350 a week in today's money. These people were poor. Zulus in Durban, South Africa, 40% of the women are obese, and women in their 40s averaged 175 pounds. The average weight of women in America today is 165 pounds. Trinidad, in the early 60s, Trinidad had a malnutrition crisis. People were starving and dying of malnutrition. The US government sends a team of researchers down to Trinidad to help out, and they come back and they report that a third of the women over 25 are obese, and that obesity is a potentially serious medical problem in women. And the next year, an MIT nutritionist went down to calculate the diet and figure out what was going on, and she reported that the per capita daily diet of the obese women was less than 2,000 calories a day, or less than what the Food and Agriculture Organization was recommending is necessary for a healthy diet. Bantu pensioners in South Africa. These are the poorest of a disenfranchised black population in South Africa. 30% of the women are severely overweight. The mean weight of the women over 60 is 165 pounds. Rarotonga in South Pacific, over 25% of the population was grossly obese. Factory workers in Chile, okay, 30% are obese and 10% suffer undernourishment. Nearly 50% of the women over 54 were obese, and most were engaged in heavy labor, okay? These are factory workers. So they're not going, for 1 hour fast walks every day. They don't belong to health clubs. They're not training for marathons. They're not running triathlons. They're working in a factory doing manual labor. I spent 3 weeks, I think it was a sophomore year of college, doing manual labor, and I couldn't stand it. And I can guarantee these people are more physically active than virtually anyone in this room, and yet they had extremely high levels of obesity. And here's another example, Mexican Americans in Starr County, Texas. This is 200 miles south of San Antonio, right on the border with Mexico. 50% of the women in their 50s are obese, 40% of the men in their 40s, and most of the inhabitants were employed in agricultural labor or work in the oil fields in the country. So if physical inactivity is necessary for obesity, what's going on with these people? These are hard-working people doing manual labor 8 hours a day, and yet they have very high levels of obesity. And there was one restaurant in Starr County, Texas in 1981. It was a Mexican restaurant. There were no McDonald's, no, boom. So the question we want to know is, why were these populations fat? Okay? Because if we can figure out why they were fat, we might know why we're fat today, and we might be able to rule out some things, like we could rule out fast food joints, because there was not a single fast food restaurant in any of these places. We could rule out supersizing. We might even be able to rule out portion size and tasty food, because these people are so poor that they can't afford to, they're not French chefs, they're not, we could imagine that we would find their food inedible. So, okay, this question was asked in 1973. Why were these people fat? By the way, I apologize if this is nothing like the lecture you had hoped to get, where I was going to explain to you exactly what to eat from the get-go. We're going to get there, okay? But we're going to get there in a kind of slow, roundabout way, because I really want you to understand where everybody's thinking went awry on here. So here's Ralph Richards, okay? This is a British diabetes specialist who goes to Kingston, Jamaica in 1961, opens a diabetes clinic at the University of the West Indies, and he says it's difficult to explain the high frequency of obesity seen in a relatively impecunious society, that's a poor society, such as exists in the West Indies when compared to the standard of living enjoyed in the more developed countries. Oh, by the way, 2/3 of the women in Jamaica were obese, according to Richards. So it basically saying the same thing. How do you explain the fact that these people can be so poor and so fat when we think rich people should be the fat ones? Malnutrition and subnutrition are common disorders in the first 2 years of life and account for almost 25% of all admissions to pediatric wards. So the kids are starving, okay? Subnutrition continues in early childhood to the early teens. They're still starving. Obesity begins to manifest itself in the female population from the 25th year of life and reaches enormous proportions from 30 onwards. So Richards can't figure it out, but he's got an open mind. Now, 2005, this fellow named Benjamin Caballero runs a laboratory of human nutrition at Johns Hopkins, asked the same question. And this was in an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the most prestigious medical journal. It was called A Nutrition Paradox: Underweight and Obesity in Developing Countries. And now Caballero's grown up with the idea we grew up in, that it's all about eating too much and being sedentary. So this is how he puts it. He says, a few years ago I was visiting a primary care clinic in the slums of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The waiting room was full of mothers with thin, stunted young children exhibiting the typical signs of chronic undernutrition. Their appearance sadly would surprise few who visit poor urban areas in the developing world. What might come as a surprise that many of the mothers holding those undernourished infants were themselves overweight. The coexistence of underweight and overweight poses a challenge to public health programs, since the aims of programs to reduce undernutrition, which is make more food available, are obviously in conflict with those for obesity prevention, make less food available. Okay? And the reason I put this poses a challenge to public health programs in italics is because this coexistence of underweight and overweight, if you have an obese mother with a child who's starving, okay, poses a challenge to what scientists call your paradigm, your fundamental belief system, okay? Because if you believe that people get fat by eating too much, that this obese mother got fat by basically eating superfluous calories that she didn't need, what you believe is that this mother was eating calories that she could give to her child to keep him alive. So she's like sneaking out of the hut at night to eat a Snickers bar that she could give to her 10-year-old to keep him alive. And that goes against everything we know about maternal behavior, according to my mother, okay? I mean, we have a paradigm maternal behavior that says mothers will starve themselves so that children will live. And in fact, you could imagine that's a good idea because if mothers preferred to let their kids starve, no species would survive past the first famine. Okay? So we have what are called competing paradigms. You have our paradigm of maternal behavior, which is mothers aren't going to eat superfluous food that they need to give their kids, keep their kids alive. And we have our paradigm of obesity, calories in over calories out. One of them has to go. And this observation to me is key. Like if I was the obesity research nutritionists should be spending their whole lives studying this, because what it tells you is that there's something wrong with one of the two paradigms. So let's look at some other inconvenient observations, okay? Things that people, don't really pay attention to and they should in this world. The first one is that if we get fat by eating too much, right, eating less should work. Because it's not just that suddenly you find yourself 50 pounds overweight and then you try to diet. As you're getting fatter and you're 10 pounds overweight, 15 pounds overweight, there's plenty of time to just eat less. Take, Mehmet Oz says eat 100 calories less a day. So if you do that, you could get rid of that extra 10, 15 pounds. And the fact that anyone gets obese suggests to us that it doesn't work. And in fact, if you look at the clinical trials where they test what used to be called semi-starvation diets, what you find is that they just don't work.